Okay. Well, I want to do two things. I'm going to be moderating this next session. We're going to do it a little bit different. All the speakers are relieved they don't have to do a rapid-fire talk, but they are going to speak for about 5 minutes on a topic, and I'll lay that out in a second. But before we go too much further, this event is the result of quite a bit of effort, if anybody has been involved in putting on conferences and so on. And it usually is done after our normally hour-and-a-half Monday meeting. We would meet after that. Angela is responsible for organizing all this. And I think it has gone very well. And I would like to acknowledge all those people who were on this planning team, kind of going, from my mind, you're going over an hour-and-a-half or 2-hour meeting, maybe, it gets long. But I'd like to acknowledge, please, Angela Pakes-Allman, Jill Sakai, where are you over here? Sabrina, Colin, Beth Jensen, Frank is there someplace, he was, and Tom Lampa has always been involved. So can you help me thank them with a little bit of applause? That would be great. It's kind of the unsung heroes. And then, of course, there were the student interns that helped on everything else. So the way we're going to do this part is, and the way this session came to be was, I got thinking, well, let's look at climate change from another different industrial perspective, a different set of lenses. And in my own work with some multinational businesses and other businesses, we found often that the risk questions and insurance questions associated with environment and with climate change were often not involved in the dialogue. Okay. So, we have classes on this in the business school, but I attempted to pull together a panel to address this, and there's kind of like a fifth column person here. Beth Churchill, where are you? Yeah, Beth is with American Family, and she's one of the other people I think that we should acknowledge works in the insurance area as well, and sustainability and climate change. So there's kind of like a fifth person as well, and I'm sure we'll be very interested to hear what you have to share with us during the discussion part. But we've got 4 panels. We have, and all of the speakers know this, when I do this, I try to bring up something new, or I make something up about all the speakers so that they're more engaged, that you can engage them more in a more friendly way. Rollie Boeding is the Director of State Risk Management, and this is his last day. He is retiring from state service of over 20-some years, 26 years of state service. So, and he was trying to get away in December, but you know how things go. And so anyway, thank you, Rollie, for being here. Then we have Rodney Taylor here from Aon, and this guy deserves a medal, because he came the furthest. He left Florida, where he lives, to come up here for one of the coldest days of the year, or for many years. And so he deserves extra something. I don't know what, maybe. Now, our next two are both grad students, and they work at the same time. Ryan Griffin is in our Sustainable Systems Engineering program. He's got his own consulting firm, and he works with Miller Coors. And his interesting little tidbit is he's a stair climber. He competes in stair climbing. What did you say? He climbed the Empire State Building or something like that, didn't he? Sears Tower. Well, one of those things. So that's his fun. And Diane Mayerfeld is with Cooperative Extension. She's an outreach specialist and the Wisconsin State Coordinator for Sustainable Agriculture, or SARE. And we talked about it for some time, and her claim to fame is she has a cat named Gaylord Nelson. I'm sure there are other things. So the way we're going to do this, or why I explained to the panel, was I asked them to address a broad question for about 5 minutes each, and then I will go through that broad question, and then I have 3 or 4 specific questions. But broadly, I think our objective here is, what is the value of climate change risk characterization / profiling / planning in your organization? And then specifically, when we get into the interactive part with you all, have you characterized how climate change is going to affect your organization from a risk perspective, supply chain effects and that sort of thing, disruption of agricultural production, water quality supply, and so on. Now, a lot of what you've heard, the themes of which you've heard already. And then the next question is, have your insurance carriers sent signals that climate change impacts are important? And then, do you have insurance to cover projected climate change impacts? Probably not. And then, what risk insurance skill sets do you need to deal with these issues would be the last one. So if you could ruminate a little bit when you think about this while they do their general talk, their general little 5-minute thing. And they don't have to, there's no slides, so it's not a big scramble like the rest of them had to do. So who would like to go first? Don't all jump up at once. Rollie? Thank you.
Good afternoon. As Pat said, I am the Director of State Risk Management for the state of Wisconsin. I've been with the state for 26 years. I've been doing this job for 22 years. The State Risk Management Program, the best way to describe it is we are like a small insurance company. We insure all state agencies, all 13 campuses. We have $24 billion of insured values. We retain a significant amount of the risk. We buy excess or reinsurance for the remainder. And we manage claims. When we had a major loss at UW-Superior, which I'll talk about, we were on site within 3 days and very aggressive in returning that campus to normal. The state and the university system in particular is already experiencing the impact of climate change. I'm not a scientist. I don't know a whole lot about climate change other than it's occurring, and that the overall average daily temperature is increasing. And for every degree that the temperature increases, I've been told that a significantly more moisture is drawn up into the atmosphere. And the end result of that is significant torrential rainfalls, where we'll get 8 to 9 inches of rain in a 12-hour period. UW-Stout had 5 inches of rain in 45 minutes. Typical normal storm water capacity is not designed for that, and we are seeing a huge impact. Give you a little perspective of the impact. Prior to 2008, the entire state of Wisconsin, including all the universities, had 2 major property losses. In 1992, we had a tornado at Oregon Correctional. 1996, we had a swine research facility at the UW-Madison Research Center that burned to the ground. Those were the only 2 losses prior to 2008 that exceeded our self-insured retention. Self-insured retention is similar to a deductible, except ours is quite high. Back in 1992, it was $2 million per occurrence. Since June of 2008, we have sustained $62.3 million in losses. 48 million of those are surface water flooding as a result of torrential rainfall, all of that on UW campuses. As a result of that, in fiscal year 08, our excess insurance, we had $19.5 billion of property. Our excess insurance cost us $1.3 million for $300 million of limits. Now that's a rate of 0.007 per 100. That's 0.7 of a penny per $100 of evaluation. We had a $2.5 million self-insured retention per occurrence and a $2.7 million annual aggregate retention. Going forward to 2014, we had $24 billion of property. We're paying $4.5 million, up from $1.3 million in 08. Our rate is now 1.8 cents per 100, which is a 157% increase. On top of that, our per occurrence is $3 million self-insured retention or deductible. Our annual aggregate is now $5 million. So we have seen significant increases in our premium, significant retention levels, and it's all a result of flooding due to surface water, due to heavy torrential rainfalls. We're estimating that the premiums, the additional retained losses on average are costing us $5 million more a year than they were in 2008. The impact on state agencies, including the UW-Madison and all of the campuses. As I said, we're like a small insurance company. We're program revenue. We look at our costs, we estimate our costs for excess insurance, for administration, for claims, and we bill those costs back to the state agencies. In fiscal year 10, a fire-resistant building, which this is considered a fire-resistant building, with a $500 deductible, we were charging the university 2.2 cents for their insurance. Fiscal year 14, we're at 3.58, and we have a $1,000 deductible. So that's a 63% increase that the university has incurred since fiscal year 10 through 14. And that's only the beginning of what we're going to see in terms of costs. Just recently, we initiated a huge flood loss control initiative. In 2008, we had flooding at UW-Oshkosh, Milwaukee, and Whitewater that accounted for about $10 million of losses. In 2011, we had Milwaukee, Whitewater, and Platteville. In 2012, we had a $24 million flood loss at UW-Superior. Entire campus was underwater. And in 2013, we had a $3 million loss at UW-Stout because of a 5-inch rainfall in about 45 minutes. So as I indicated, we're initiating a huge property loss control. We're starting with all 13 campuses. We're requiring all the campuses to develop campus-wide storm drainage analysis and flood mitigation plans. Our hope is that in the first 2 years, we can look at all what we call the low-hanging fruit. For example, the flood we had at UW-Stout. The building sat here. Here was the sidewalk and the street. And between the sidewalk and the street, there was a lowland. Now it had a storm sewer system, but at ground level was also an air intake system to the basement. Oops. When the street filled up over the sidewalk into the low area, storm sewer system couldn't handle it, flooded the air intake and let $3 million within an hour. The entire basement was flooded. That's the low-hanging fruit. That's the analysis that we need to do. I mean, honestly, that probably should have been captured many years ago and remediated. But those are the initial steps that we need to take. My estimate is before we begin, and this is a very ballpark estimate, and I say we, it's not going to be me, it's going to be somebody else. But long term, this will cost the state hundreds of millions of dollars of retrofitting buildings to prevent flood losses. We've identified equipment and contents in below grade levels. And you walk around through the universities, and the same as with state agencies, tremendous amount of content and equipment below grade. A lot of that's going to have to be moved. Some of it can be mitigated and prevented. But in my estimation, because of what we're experiencing with torrential rainfall as a result of what I'm told is warming temperatures, we will incur hundreds of millions of dollars in preventive action going forward. Now, you look at it from our perspective, we're the state of Wisconsin. Imagine Miami or New York when they're along the ocean, and we have issues related to that. So the insurance carriers for years have been studying it, and now they're seeing some of the impact, and I would have never guessed 6 years ago that we would have experienced what we've had in the last 6 years. Almost $50 million of flood losses just from rainfall.
Thank you. Next, who would like to go next? Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, first of all, it's a great honor to be here as a current UW student in the Sustainable Systems Engineering program. So really humbled by the experts sitting next to me. So hopefully I can do some justice to what I want to talk about. But I guess the reason I'm here is because of my experience in the brewing industry. I've worked in supply chain at General Mills in the food industry, and then probably about the better half of the last decade at Miller Coors in brewing. And I've kind of seen the enterprise from top to bottom, and also have a good assessment of where the risk lies from climate change. So I guess to start, climate change risks aren't really something new to the brewing industry. I would say climate change is more of a risk multiplier. So things like water availability, especially water, is something that has been with us for hundreds of years. As a matter of fact, it's why Fred Miller founded a brewery in Milwaukee on the shore of Lake Michigan, and why Adolf Coors founded a brewery on, in the Rocky Mountains. So water has always been integral, but the supply risks, I think, are being multiplied by the challenges that we see coming with climate change. So it really touches all aspects of supply chain, all the way from the barley farmers and the hops farmers that use water to create our raw materials, to the transportation that exists between those and our 8 breweries. And the actual water used in the brewing process is a possible thing that can be shorted with climate change or jeopardized or put at risk. Finally, sales. So we have a 3-tier system where we have distributors, retailers that are selling our product, and frankly, when there's extreme weather events, people aren't buying as much beer. So whether it's a hurricane or the polar vortex, people aren't drinking with their neighbors on their back porch. That's just kind of a fact of life. So as a matter of fact, January of this year is 7.5% lower bar and retail sales than January of last year. So the cold weather is having a big impact right now. So I am not a Miller Coors employee anymore. I went out on my own about a year ago, decided to bet my career on climate change, and figured that's probably the most important thing I could be working on, and I hope to help other organizations build their capabilities to deal with climate change and help mitigate it. So looking forward to questions you have, and just want to say that I'm also proud of all the work that Miller Coors has done in regard to the environment. I won't go through all the facts and figures now, but with water especially, they're really leading the industry. So I'd be happy to answer any questions around water and how our beer is 90% water. 90% of the water that the company uses is in agriculture, and those are the guys. The farmers are on the front line of climate change, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to work with them to improve the way that they deal with that. So with that, I will pass it on.
Right.
Ryan, in retirement, I'll do my best to make up that shortfall in sales.
Very good.
Diane, that might be a natural segue to your focus.
All right, I'll
Not the beer drinking part.
go next. It's kind of peculiar for me to be here, I think, representing the agriculture industry, because usually I'm seen as a bit of an outlier because I work on sustainable agriculture. And there was a lot of discussion this morning that it's only that farmers, quote, don't believe in climate change. And, the charts that Paul showed that somewhere between 25 and 40% of Wisconsin farmers do acknowledge climate change, and I probably proportionately talk to that group. So, and I would also say, when we sort of characterize a whole group like farmers, to remember that there is that variation within that group, and it's the figures are a little bit more extreme than for Wisconsin as a whole, but even Wisconsin as a whole, the population as a whole, the numbers are not as high as perhaps people in this room would like to see. That said, I work at the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems, which has a group of farmers that advises it and helps set our center's policy. And that Citizens Advisory Council wants us to work on climate change as one area. So farmers are not a monolithic block. And at our meeting just a couple of weeks ago, I heard some very eloquent comments from particularly the apple grower about the difficulty of someone who works in a perennial system like apples to respond to uncertainty about climate. It's one thing if you're growing corn or soybeans, you make your decisions on an annual basis. It's hard enough growing an annual crop. But someone like this, he said, when he tries to figure out which varieties he's going to plant, not knowing which way the weather is going to go, poses additional barriers for him. And when you think about the agriculture industry as a whole, I think it's true to say that they're very cautious about talking about climate change for a whole range of reasons. But I would say the university part of that and the U.S. Department of Agriculture part of that do recognize that climate change is a big driver of current and future risks for agriculture. The picture's a little complicated because climate change can cause some benefits for agriculture, and so that muddies the waters a little bit. Anybody who does gardening in this area will know that those hardiness zones are changing, and that can cause opportunities. You can plant higher yielding crops because the longer the growing season you have, the higher your yields can be. You may be able to look at crops you weren't able to look at. But let me dwell more on some of the climate change risks that have been identified. People have talked about flooding, and that's very much a risk for farmers as well. Both standing water in the fields or just wet fields. If you try to go into wet fields, you hurt your soil quality. So farmers don't want to do that, and also your crops won't generate in water-saturated fields, and won't germinate in water-saturated fields. Drought, increased occurrence of drought, and you can get excessively wet springs and water stress in the same year. People mentioned already increases in disease, insect, and weed pressures. All of those pests can respond favorably to less cold winters, longer growing seasons, and more humidity, all of which are associated with climate change. Just straight heat stress. Even crops that like it warm, that are warm season crops, don't like it really hot and don't like it when it doesn't cool down at night. It's particularly a challenge for livestock, so that's another area of risk. And then there are things like the increase in freeze-thaw cycles in the winter. So something like alfalfa, which is a major crop in our dairy state, it is winter hardy, but it is sensitive to freeze and thaw. And so we've had probably increased incidence of alfalfa winter kill as we've had those winters where it warms up and then the plant becomes more sensitive because its winter hardening, its winter dormancy goes away. So I would characterize there's several ways that agriculture can and is responding to that. I am really not very knowledgeable about the insurance end. There is, insurance in agriculture is a federally subsidized program, and the Farm Bill, which recently passed, which cut many areas, did somewhat increase the funding for crop insurance. But there was no, as far as I know, I could not find any explicit discussion linking that with concerns about climate change. It was, so there could be all sorts of causes for that increase in insurance, but it did happen. That said, that insurance program insures both against climate risks or crop damage risks and also against price risks because volatile prices can cause losses as well. So it's a very complicated picture, and you have to be careful about what conclusions you draw from that. I would say there's also perhaps a secondary insurance program out there, which is the politics of how Congress responds to severe climate or weather problems, shall we say, for agriculture, which is they can pass emergency legislation. So that insurance picture, I think, is quite different from a private insurance picture, and I really don't know much more about it than that. So I'm going to talk more about what strategies farmers can use to manage their risk. And I'd characterize them into what I might call engineering strategies and then what I might call agroecological strategies. So engineering strategies include things like putting in irrigation or expanding the amount of irrigation you have, putting in field drainage so that you can reduce the water levels in your fields, say in too much rain in the spring more quickly. Relying more on new pesticides, increased use of pesticides to manage all those weeds, diseases, and insects, or relying on new development of, say, genetically modified crops that have insecticides built into the crop. You can respond by putting livestock indoors. Those are all sort of engineering responses. They're all part of the picture. Whether they are specific, they are responses to risk. Whether they aren't necessarily driven by perception of climate change, but they are a way to deal with the risk of climate change. They're also responses in some cases to price. So for instance, the number of irrigation wells that are put in respond, I talked to someone at DNR, and they respond to 2 different signals, according to DNR's observations. One of those is a drought, and the other one is high prices. And so in 2012, we had both a very severe drought and very high prices for all grains. And so we saw a huge spike in the number of wells going in. So as I say, those are all things that farmers are doing. And then I want to talk a little bit about the agroecological responses. There's been a big push by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education program I work for, but also the Natural Resources Conservation Service, to focus on building soil health and organic matter. And that really helps protect farmers against risk in a couple of ways. Having good soil health and a good amount of organic matter in your soils really helps with water management. It helps soils absorb water much better, and it also helps them retain water. So it really helps respond to both that flooding risk and to that drought stress risk. So there's been a big push in that, and there's been, someone mentioned this morning, we've been seeing farmers respond to some of the practices that help build that, like increased cover crops. Okay, I'll be quick. And so those agroecological responses are an important part, but an important part of the response, and farmers are open to those. But we have a huge knowledge gap in how to do those in a cost-effective manner, and how to do those in a way that doesn't also cause risks for farmers. Because if you introduce a new crop into a crop rotation, that can also bring up different risks. If you do something like bring in perennials into your rotation, you're making long-term investments, and that raises your risk again. The plus side of those is that they both help adapt to risk, but many of them also help mitigate against climate change.
Thank you, Diane. Rodney, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here, even though I had to leave 81 degrees in Orlando and fly into 4 degrees up here. But it's fun to do these kinds of programs and to see the various points of view, and especially to see the enthusiasm of a student body and people who are still idealistic about the way things work, and hopefully they'll be able to change enough of it that their idealism will carry over. And we heard some of that discussion earlier about how to make changes, and it isn't easy, and I'm sure many of you will find that out. I have the job of talking about what the insurance industry is doing. I work for Aon, which is an insurance risk consultancy and insurance broker, and we place insurance on behalf of thousands of clients, including the state and the university here and a number of other folks in town and people all over the world. The group of people that we represent are in every kind of industry, every kind of commercial activity, and every kind of institutional operation. And so we see a broad spectrum, and so I'll build on what was mentioned here with some of the property damage losses and talk about some of the things that we see across the range of clients. We as an organization don't have significant risks associated with climate change. We're a professional organization with about 60,000 employees, and we operate out of office buildings in major cities, and so we don't have a big footprint, and we don't have a lot of exposure. But even we've had some issues with climate change. But what I want to talk about is, because our job is to identify and help people address the risks in their business, is what we do to try and fulfill that expectancy of the part of our clients who deal with us on every other form of risk, and they expect us to be conversant on climate change. I'm sort of the thought leader in our organization, and it's a bit of a challenge because the insurance industry has not really caught up with some of these things yet. And so when you talk about climate change, there's no climate change insurance policy. I'd like to sell you one, but there is no such thing. There are policies that respond, or property policies, as we saw, and then there are other policies, and particularly business interruptions become a huge element of most of these kinds of losses. So on top of the physical damage, you'll have the loss of use of a facility for a long period of time, and some of those have been far greater than the restoration of the physical damage. Then there is an aspect of it that is third-party liability claims, and we have a number of clients who have experienced those, where the Alaskan Natives bring a claim against the power generators and the automobile manufacturers, saying my ice is no longer forming up here and my island's being overrun. So there's a third-party element to climate change, which a lot of folks have already dealt with. And even if you win those kinds of suits, which so far industry's done pretty well, there's some substantial costs absorbed in the defense of those. So we have all of those kinds of things going on. The reason that there's no policy for climate change is it's not excluded from your typical policies, which people buy every day. The property policy that the state buys covers most of the things that happen: floods, windstorm, the extremes of temperature. So there's no need for a separate policy yet. The third-party liability coverage that people buy doesn't have an exclusion for climate change. For the most part, I've had one or two policies where we actually had one, but it's not generally part of the policy. So there's not a need yet for that. So what is there a need for in terms of what we do? And what we need to do most of the time is help people identify risks, quantify the risks, and then plan for a risk management program that's responsive to that. And identifying risks is a matter of information, education, and data. And our company prepares and presents data. This is the 2013 catastrophic losses, and it includes just pages and pages of data that talk about what were the large losses, what were the insured large losses, and what caused those losses and where they were. So we have a lot of data, and that's necessary to convince people that they have the risk. Beyond that, it's a matter of going from the macro to the micro and dealing with an individual client's risks and looking at what they're exposed to from a standpoint of their business operations. And what people are doing that is part of what our job is. The responses that I've seen are people are generally purchasing much more substantial limits than they were in the property and business interruption areas. And that's partly because of not only the losses that occur in their own facilities, but also supply chain losses. You can buy contingent business interruption insurance, which pays you in the event that you're unable to continue operations as a result of a loss that occurs somewhere else. So your supplier had a flood and can't get the material out to you. If your business is affected by that, that's an insurable risk, and people are buying substantial limits for that. People are buying third-party liability insurance, probably not with that in mind, but they're at least looking at it. The other risk that most people don't think about that is affected by this is directors and officers liability. Directors and officers can have claims brought against them even if you don't prove that your exhaust emissions or your airborne emissions have caused climate change and affected me. You can have a shareholder bring a claim against you because as a director or officer of that company, you didn't see what was evident to everybody else. And so you haven't taken the measures that everybody else took when they got rid of their old plants and they modified the fuel sources. So directors and officers have to be concerned about it because they can wind up with liability even if there's never proof that their plant specifically caused a climate change. Without going into a lot of this, I do want to talk a little bit about a few of the things that we've dealt with so far. Our clients, let's skip that. I think I'll stop there because we'll have other areas of comment.
Interact. So what I'm going to do now is we'll open the floor for questions. And looks like there's one in the back there, Eleanor. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Yep. And then that one, the back, she had her hand up first, and then this one.
So much for being here. I think this has probably been one of the more relevant panels that I've seen so far in terms of my own work. a lot of the difficulties I run into is language and how to communicate climate change in a way that people are interested in and not alienated by. And, you know, Ryan said climate change isn't necessarily new, it's a multiplier. And Rodney was saying that it's, you know, there isn't a separate climate change package that people purchase, it's a part of things. And Diane was saying that, you know, climate change can present other risks, you know, by fixing one thing, you might cause another problem. And I'm just wondering about what your guys' opinions are on kind of reframing climate change to be something that is more risk management based, and that if that is potentially a way that we could reach more people, and you know, instead of presenting it as this dire future, that we can be more scientifically balanced and show the potential good, as Diane was saying, and also the risks. So I'm just curious if you guys think that would be a good avenue to go. Thanks.
I have a thought about that. The thing that I do in dealing with so many clients, you never know who is going to have an interest in one side or the other of this. And we have petroleum companies, and we have people that are in mining and every kind of heavy industry. And so some of them really take offense at the thought that the human contribution might be part of the picture. So what I do in discussions with these people is avoid what the causation is and talk about what somebody mentioned earlier, which is the result. I mean, it's clear that it's happening. We didn't have, you know, these drastic events and the damage, and so if you do focus on the risk management aspects of it, you don't have to get into the politics. And so I have my own beliefs about what is going on, but I seldom express those in any of the discussions that I have with clients.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Rollie, you want to quick?
I'm in total agreement. Whenever I have any discussion about climate change and the impact of climate change, I preface all of that I don't want to discuss the cause. I want to discuss the results and move past the cause, because it's so political. And just let's move on beyond that right now. Let's talk about what we're going to do about the results.
So I've seen something unique because Miller Coors has a parent company that's based in London, and they've actually had a really aggressive carbon reduction strategy to cut carbon emissions in half by 2020. So that means the whole globe, and not just the U.S. But the funny thing is, in the U.S., we don't talk about carbon at all. We talk about energy and water, but knowing that those are directly related, it does tie together. And it's just that word here, carbon just seems to be a hot button kind of thing. And if you can frame things around saving energy, reducing water usage, that saves money, it's oftentimes more relevant to some of the discussions we have locally.
Just a quick answer, because we got one more question, and then we have to move to the next panel. So it's a really
Okay.
quick one, Diane.
I agree that can be a very good way to open up the conversation, and that is in fact the approach that most of the extension agents I know are taking, both the ones working with communities and the ones working with farmers. I would say that that can't be your whole strategy, because then that would direct you towards those engineering responses, if you will, and you'd be less likely to even do the research and pursue the more comprehensive long-term responses. So it has to be both.
Okay, my quick question has to do sort of with behavior change and then climate change from insurance. In the insurance industry, you promote change, like if you get an alarm system in your house, it decreases the amount that you pay on your premium. Are there any discussions about if you do carbon footprint calculations or you do reductions in your carbon footprint, that will decrease your premium? I know that's sort of far-fetched from now, but is there any conversation about, your liability or your liability in the carbon?
Yeah, there are discussions that are probably broader than that. They have more to do with the sustainable construction movement. And so it doesn't just talk about one thing, but it'll talk about LEED certification. Is that an indicator of a better risk than a building that's not certified? So we have looked at that, and there are some credits for certain things, and there are insurance policies that address restoration of those green features of the buildings as well, which is important if you're buying coverage. Now, what the insurance industry has done, and I should mention this, while there's no exclusions in policies, they have vacated from large areas of the highest risk portions of climate change. The federal flood program that insures all residential floods is a FEMA program that took that away from the commercial insurance industry. In Florida, the windstorm is taken away from the industry and now placed with a state operation. And we see all of those things happening, and so the insurance industry for a long period of time has made adjustments to deal with certain aspects of climate change, and they don't make a big deal of that, but they have in fact done that. Now, hopefully we can get back to where if they're allowed to charge rates that reflect the actual losses, we could get away from those kinds of subsidized and artificial programs. Crop insurance, as you mentioned, is also heavily subsidized, which has been probably a very good thing for farming community, but you know, it's another factor where we subsidize losses in specific areas.
Great. Well, I'm mindful of the time, and I know there's another panel that has to follow. So help me thank again the panel, Rodney, Rollie, Ryan, and Diane. Thank you, thank you. I'm sure you could catch